if there are no strong security guarantees, no NATO, no military contingent deployed, no long-range weaponry, how do you think, if Putin comes back, he will definitely come back with the army 10 times more than the grouping he had in the very beginning of 2022, because it is already almost 4.5 times more than it was. And when he comes back with this grouping for the full occupation of the countries that are former republics of the USSR, that is number one, and then he will do what he has done with our Crimea. He will be coming to other EU and NATO countries. He will be bringing us and you, everybody, to the world that lives in his head, in case there are no strong security guarantees.
I thought it was ironic that there at the end he said that Putin is the one who is creating fiction in his head that doesn't exist. And gracious, when you look at a map and you look at what's happened over the last 18 months or so, just as a minimum, there's probably somebody who's not looking at things realistically, and it isn't coming out of Moscow.
This is an artificial world created by the so-called globalists, neocons, whatever you want to call them, hijacked our government and gained control of most of the governments, certainly in Western Europe. And in this artificial world, those kinds of statements are taken seriously. We know they're all nonsense. President Putin has absolutely no interest in marching further west, but he's going to do whatever is required to secure his country's interests in Eastern Europe. That's very simple. And right now, that's stabilizing Eastern Ukraine, coming into a new territorial arrangement, and hopefully with us and our so-called European allies, some sort of arrangement regarding the size and movement of forces. You know, one of the more disturbing things that I've heard recently is an attempt to link nuclear arms reductions to some sort of deal in Ukraine. The Russians are happy to talk to us about reductions in nuclear armaments, but it's not going to be linked to Ukraine. Ukraine is an entirely different set of circumstances, but it's back to this notion of we want Ukraine to join NATO. By the time this war ends, I don't think there will be a NATO. This is self-delusion on a titanic scale. You know, there's something else that's wrong here. President Trump is not a stupid man. He knows this is not his war. He's under no obligation to pick it up and carry it forward. He's making a mistake that Nixon made in 1968 or 1969 by pressing forward into Cambodia, widening the war, ultimately sustaining more casualties, more human losses after he becomes president than Johnson sustained while he was president. This is unnecessary. President Trump needs to get out of it. He has a very, very ambitious domestic policy agenda. If he wants to achieve anything with that domestic policy agenda, he needs to shut down these overseas adventures. None of these things are important to us as Americans, not a bit.
I want to zero in on the first thing that Zelensky was saying there, though. You talk about there's an agenda with what a lot of the Western European countries want, et cetera, and obviously they seem to be very intent and happy to do anything that's going to, quote, harm Russia. But that has a limit, and if it harms them too much, apparently, there could be some limit there. Do you think there's any prospect that Zelensky was asking there that he wants literal security guarantees from Europe? Is there any states in Europe that are willing to go to war to Russia in order to protect Zelensky?
Not that I'm aware, although Starmer's London government has made noises in that direction. Of course, Starmer's government is on slippery ice these days. I don't think he's going to last much longer. I think he's about to go the way of Liz Truss. Bismarck was asked, I think in 1875, what would you do if the British Army landed on the shores of Germany? Bismarck scoffed and said, well, I'd send the police out to arrest it. And people sort of stood back and said, what does he mean? Well, what he meant was very true. The British Army was so small, so incapable, that it posed absolutely no threat to the German state or the German people. And if that was going to be an instrument of strategic statecraft, it would fail. Well, you've got a similar situation today. Anybody in Europe who stands up and talks about we're going to punish Russia militarily, short of nuclear weapons. And of course, the use of any nuclear weapon is instantaneous suicide. But if you're going to try and do it at all, you're going to be annihilated. The Russians will annihilate them. They're very practiced now. They understand how this new form of warfare works.
Well,
So
now,
I think,
actually, Doug, on that line, I want to ask you something. I'm gonna pull up here from your book, Margin of Victory, which you published here before, and in one of these sections here, you're talking about stuff that happened during World War II, and I think it's very instructive here because one of the reasons people don't believe what you just said, that the Russian army is all that they need to be worried about it, and why some even think it's possible to give security guarantees, is because they see what happened in the Kherson city, where Russia was forced out in the early or the late summer of 2022, and the Kharkiv area where they were pushed out a lot too. So a lot of the popular belief is that Russia was a lot weaker than they thought, and they probably still are. But here's something that you wrote that I think is very instructive. I don't know if you can tell me how this applies to this current situation. You wrote, during the night of 14-15 September 1941, the armored spearheads of two German armies met at Lokitsa, 120 miles east of Kiev, forming an iron ring around 1.6 million Soviet troops. In what turned into the greatest battle of annihilation in recorded human history, the German Wehrmacht destroyed 4 entire Soviet armies and most of 2 others, inflicting 1 million casualties and capturing 665,000 Soviet soldiers. So one might think that with that level of losses, the war is going to be over right then. But as you continue on, less than 3 years later, on 22 June 1944, the third anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, 2.5 million Soviet troops launched an offensive striking German Army Group Center along a 360-mile front offensive, ending at a great semicircle at the Moser on the Pripyat River to the Darwana River. Without interference from the German Luftwaffe, Soviet spearheads had advanced over 125 miles in less than 12 days. By the time the Soviets recaptured Minsk on 3 July, 25 divisions and 250,000 troops had simply vanished. How did Russia go from losing a million and almost 1.6 million people total to then turn it around just 3 years later to go on this juggernaut? And is there any comparison to the current Russian military?
well, let me reference something else that some people in the audience may remember, that the Romans suffered catastrophic defeats at the hands of Hannibal, but the Romans built their forces up, restored their forces, changed their forces, adapted them, and eventually they ground the Carthaginians into the dust. You have something similar that happens during World War II. Now, admittedly, I know the Russians don't like to talk about this sort of thing, but we destroyed Germany's oil industry. So by June of 1945, there was enough fuel to keep 1 German aircraft in the air for about 2 hours, which of course is nothing. And most of the German aircraft were above German cities, trying to prevent the cities from being annihilated from the air by the US and British Air Forces. So this was of enormous value to the Russians, who no longer had to deal with effective German tactical air support. The point is, though, that the Russians always have and have always had the advantage of falling back into the interior. When the Mongols destroyed Kiev in the 13th century, or I guess it's the 13th century, they fell back and then finally moved north. That's why the center of gravity for Eastern Slavic civilization and Christianity moves north to where it is now in Moscow and Smolensk, because the Mongols destroyed Kiev. And they came back again and again and again. They have the depth, they have the cohesion, they have the willpower, the resolve, and the determination. And so we've seen that happen here again. The Russians confronted an enemy they frankly had underestimated. They were aware that we were building a force composed of Ukrainians designed to threaten Russia. They knew that. They knew they needed to intervene to stop it, but they had no idea how strong it was, how much power it could mobilize. And finally, they underestimated their ability to impress us with the small force they sent in to begin with. Well, that's history, meaningless today. And the destruction of Army Group Center is not a bad analogy for what's happened to the Ukrainians. They are on the verge of going out of business completely. And I wish somebody would stand up and tell the truth, and that includes President Trump, because if he has a humanitarian bone in his body, he should seek to stop this war, period. Stop the losses on all sides. We do not benefit from the deaths of Russians or Ukrainians. I don't know why anybody would say such a thing. But then again, I look at the people who've hijacked control of our government over the last several years and how much hatred they seem to feel for Russia and how much hatred they seem to feel for everyone in the Middle East. I guess that's the explanation, but it doesn't make any sense to us as Americans. We have no interest in this mass murder that has been going on. None.
Well, don't. And one wonders if that's going to be forced upon those that are in power here, because I showed you both Trump and Kellogg, who seem to both confidently think that Russia's hurting and therefore they're in need of a negotiated settlement. But then when you look and see what the Ukraine side or the Russian side is saying, they are not quite as tentative as one might think in light of what's going on here. We've had Sergei Lavrov, who said, absolutely no circumstances will we do a ceasefire or a pause, because he said that was only help the other side and it would harm Russia because Russia's on the advantage. And then you see Putin himself, who seems, pretty confident.
What we need is not just a ceasefire. We need peace, a long-lasting peace.
We don't have any preconditions for talks. We are ready to engage in a conversation without preconditions. But there has to be a basis of something that we've agreed upon during the talks in Istanbul in late 2022. And based, of course, on the realities on the ground at this moment.
He's talking about realities on the ground. I think that what he has in mind and why he is so confident is, first of all, we have General Syrskyi, the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, is admitting straight up that they don't have, even with forced mobilization, they can't bring enough troops in. So they are already, every single day, are suffering a net loss to their combat capacity. You've also got here in just the last few weeks, you have first the famous 155th Brigade that was trained in Paris to much fanfare, disintegrated before it even got to the front line. And then now here a couple of days ago, you had the 155th Brigade, a new brigade that was formed in Ukraine itself, likewise fell apart before it came. So I think Putin can see that the forces arrayed against him are literally falling apart by the day. So he can confidently say, I'm not interested in a ceasefire, but he does want a peaceful solution. Do you think that Russia is just saying that and that maybe they're not as strong as they believe? Or do you think he's right?
Well, you also have this man, Budanov, who is the leader of the State Committee on Intelligence in Kiev. And Budanov is nothing if not a complete fanatic, devoted to the idea of killing and destroying as many Russians as possible. And he's effectively said the same thing, that unless extreme measures are adopted, the war is effectively over. Ukraine will not survive. Now, one of the reasons I bring him up is that there's been some talk in the press about some sort of false flag nuclear event with either a nuclear reactor or a dirty bomb or something else. And I would tell you that the one individual whose group is capable of just that sort of insanity is Budanov. And I hope everybody pays attention to that name and watches that very carefully, because that's something that he could do, I think, if he has the right resources at his disposal. And remember, he's strongly backed by the CIA and MI6. Now, the war is effectively over. That's true. But there's a different way to look at everything that President Putin has just said. If you're sitting where President Trump is, knowing his views geostrategically on Europe and NATO, this is an opportunity to do two things. First, go ahead, suspend the aid, military aid to Ukraine. That will bring the war to an end. Then pull out immediately all American military and non-military personnel, intelligence. It doesn't make any difference. Bring them all out. Get all the Americans out of Ukraine. And then simply send a note to President Putin that when it's convenient, that we're willing to discuss a larger solution to the security situation in Central East Europe, because the war itself is over. We're not talking about the war anymore. That's a done deal, so to say. President Trump needs to understand that. He has an opportunity, though, now to come to a larger agreement with the Russians in Europe. That's a very important thing to do because Putin wants peace in Europe. The Europeans want peace with Russia. We should want peace with Russia and cooperation with Russia. There is no particular strategic reason why we should be in conflict with Moscow. I would argue that there hasn't been any since Stalin was in power. But the bottom line is that's where we should be thinking right now. If we meet with the Russians, let's listen to them. What is their proposal for a security arrangement in Europe that prevents any further bloodshed, any further warfare from breaking out? We should do that. Then we can sit back and say, well, we agree with this and this. We're not too keen on that and that. In other words, you can pick and choose and you can talk. You know, this is called diplomacy and negotiation. But what we don't need is to lobotomize ourselves, which is effectively what we're doing right now by answering anything that comes across the desk as, if you don't do what we want, we're going to bully you. We're going to tariff you. We're going to harm you. You know, you're not going to have much success with that. Biden's been doing that, since 2022? Look how successful he's been. So this is all nonsense. Somebody has to present that to the president in an unambiguous fashion. This is a once in a several decades opportunity to come to an arrangement that could work to the benefit of us, as well as the Russians and the people living in Ukraine and the rest of Europe.